много чего говорить и рассказывать.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Atlantic Council and to this provocative conversation about a new report just issued today. You can find it on the Atlantic Council's website, Russia After Putin, How to Rebuild the State. I want to welcome all of you and give us a quick introduction to our dual capital event this morning. We have speakers in both Moscow and Washington today. Why don't I start with those who are joining us from Russia? We have Vladimir Kara-Murza, who is the chairman of the Boris Nemtsov Foundation for Freedom. And for those of you who are not already familiar with his extraordinary story, I recommend that you look at his piece in the Washington Post or read the recent Bellingcat investigation of his own trials at the hands of the Putin government in recent years. We are also joined by Kirill Martynov, the political editor of Novaya Gazeta, the independent newspaper. Kirill, thank you so much for joining us from Moscow today. And Leonid Gozman, well-known Russian politician and commentator and co-author with Dr. Anders Åslund of the report. Leonid, thank you so much for being with us today, this morning, or this afternoon from Moscow. Here in Washington, with me as well are Anders Åslund, as I mentioned, of the Atlantic Council, who is not only a senior fellow at the Eurasia Center, but of course is a co-author of today's report, which imagines and puts us inside a scenario in which there's a post-Putin regime of some kind in Russia and what work would need to be done to build a democratic Russia. Anders, thank you so much for inviting all of us today for this report launch. And last but certainly not least, my friend, Ambassador Sandy Vershbow, who not only is a former ambassador to Russia, but also served as Deputy Secretary General of NATO and is, I think, perhaps one of the US's leading Russiologists, if you will. Sandy, thank you so much for being with us today. I want to just jump right in because there's so much to discuss both in this provocative report and what we should make of it, the surround sound, if you will, to it. I will also make sure later in the conversation to get to your questions. So we're on Zoom, and if you're able to use the Q&A function on Zoom when it's time for that, I will go ahead and get to as many of your questions as possible. So be thinking about that now. So I want to just jump right in, Anders and Leonid, with this report, which obviously is meant to be a provocation. One thing I felt when reading it is just the overwhelming amount of things that would be done essentially to rebuild and reconstruct the Russian state in a more democratic mold if and when change were to come to the government. You essentially propose a sweeping blowing up of the system as it exists right now in order to create a more democratic Russia. So Leonid, I want to ask you, you're sitting there in Moscow, to start us off, how realistic is this exercise? I mean, do you really see this moment as a beginning of the end of the Putin government? What should we make of this exercise? Is it anything other than purely academic in your view?
Well, thank you so much, Susan, and I'm very glad to be, very glad to be here because I think that on this here in Atlantic Council, there are people who understand our reality better than many others. And I'm from Moscow now, and I'm more or less optimistic, maybe because I'm stupid, I don't know. But I really believe in the good chances of this country. And there's one very good news about Russia now, and my Moscow friends, I think, will agree with me that it's a very interesting country now. It's really very interesting, and it's a changing country. And it's changed so rapidly that the text we wrote about Russia together with Anders, it was written for about another country, not about the country we have now, because the changes are really fantastic. So this system is still very strong. They have money, they have special troops, they have everything, but I think it has no future. Why? Because for several reasons. First, it's a very deep moral crisis, very deep. If you say about any minister of any government that this guy had stolen $1 billion, nobody will be surprised. Nobody. The only surprise, why only one but not five? Okay. And nobody interested in the president. When he speaks, when he had a press conference or something like this, nobody switched on the TV set. Nobody asked anybody else, well, I missed his speech, what did he say? Nobody interested in him at all, nobody cares. And those people, it's about 35%, not less, in the country, who are very stable in support of him. They are very passive. They are very passive. Look, on these dramatic days after Navalny's return to Moscow, we had no any one civic act of the support of the government or the president himself, not anyone. And the Russian elites, they are dissatisfied. When you talk with them, they are very disappointed and they are very anxious, and they're disappointed in the president because he didn't express himself as a brave man. So I think that now the probability of the palace coup increased dramatically, and the government has no supporters. Okay, there are people who hate Americans or liberals, or both Americans and liberals, more than Putin. Of course, there are such people, a lot of them. But there are no people who, sorry, I'm psychologist for using such psychological terms, who loves people, who are for him. In August 1991, I was so happy to be in Moscow, and so I was near our White House, near the residence of President Yeltsin. And these 100,000 people who surrounded this residence, they were ready to die. They were ready to die. Now you cannot find any one person all around the country who is ready to die for this system. And this system has no future. Has no future, not objectively. It has no the picture of the future. It has no the picture. They want to live in today, to live today and only today. And please do not overestimate such factor as the success in suppressing protests. Our last Tsar, Nicholas II, showed the demonstration on Bloody Sunday. It didn't help him. It didn't help him. And we don't know, of course, how it will collapse. We don't know. Will it rot itself, or it will collapse under the blows of our protests or your sanctions? No, but you know, I hope you heard about the mold on Putin's palace. It's a very symbolic thing. It's a very symbolic thing. This system covered by the mold. You know, the only thing we know about revolutions is that we do not know when exactly they happened. And 3 days before Egypt revolution, I talked with the group of historians from Cairo. They came from Cairo, and I asked, is Mubarak for forever? They said, yes, of course, forever. And after his death, it will be his son. They were sure. They were very well educated guys from Cairo, from Egypt, and they didn't expect it. They didn't expect it. You know, my previous life, when I used to be just psychologist and academic, my PhD and my studies was about emotional relationships, like personal attraction, love, family, and so on. And let me say, as a specialist in that field, that you cannot predict, you never can predict when and how the relationships will collapse. You cannot do it.
I think that's a great moment to bring in Anders as well to talk about why you decided to do this report, because your Egypt example actually is exactly what I was going to ask you and Anders, because the revolution came in Egypt, but it didn't turn out exactly as the people in Tahrir Square hoped for it to be. And if anything, it might be a cautionary tale for Russia. You have produced, Anders, a very optimistic report about what a democratic Russia small d could look like. First of all, it's optimistic, the idea that because there are these protests in the wake of Navalny's arrest, that it means something different for the regime. And then second of all, that the change that might come would end up being positive as opposed to potentially negative. So Anders, walk us through a little bit your assumptions in this very optimistic exercise. Oh, you're muted.
Thank you, Susan. Well, the reason why we did this is, so to say, twofold. One is I lived personally in Moscow, 84 to 87 as a Swedish diplomat. At that time, nobody thought that anything could ever change. I thought that the system was moribund and had to collapse pretty soon. It did. But the general perception among Russians was that nothing can ever change in this country in our lifetime. And the other, both Leonid and I, we were working as advisor to the Yegor Gaidar and his government. And one could see certain things that could be done that were not done then were crucial. And I would emphasize a few things. First, you need to get rid of FSB. Yeltsin cut it down to half and divided into 5 organizations. That was not enough. It has fully revived and become stronger than ever now. The second was what I thought then, that Russia needed early elections. Yeltsin was strongly against that. He thought that he first needed to divide Russia from the Soviet Union, and that he needed focus on the economy and wanted to rule by decree. That was a fundamental mistake. So early elections are vital. And what you say, what went wrong in Egypt? Well, one fundamental thing was that they didn't have any legitimate ruling body. Russia at the time had Yeltsin as a legitimate president. His mistake was that he didn't do anything about the parliament. Early parliamentary elections are vital. And then what was not possible then was to get a decent legal system. So do away with the KGB, have early parliamentary elections, and reform the judicial system from the top down. These are the 3 big things that need to be done. And in a revolutionary situation, as it probably will be, you have little capacity. You can't do, for example, medical reforms, because that requires education reforms, that requires a lot of people and detail, but you can do the big things. And that's what one needs to concentrate on to build a new system. So those were our basic thoughts.
Well, thank you so much. So Vladimir, I want to bring in Vladimir Kara-Murza now. You also are in Moscow. And I want to ask you, first of all, whether you agree with Leonid that it's a whole different Russia in some ways in the last few weeks when you look at the scale and scope of the reaction to and the uprising against the arrest of Navalny. I recognize that your career is that of a professional optimist. One needs to be a professional optimist to be, in effect, a dissident and an activist in Putin's Russia. But I am curious whether, how you would assess the events of the last few weeks, and against that, what you make of this very ambitious but also very sweeping report that Anders and Leonid have produced.
Thank you so much, Susan, and thank you to the Atlantic Council for hosting our virtual conversation this morning, your time, this afternoon, our time. I am indeed an optimist, Susan, but I am also a historian by education, and it really does help to know the history of our country, to sort of be able to participate in political life today. And the one thing we do know about Russian history, certainly modern Russian history, is that major political changes here happen suddenly and unexpectedly, including unexpectedly for the participants of these changes themselves. That is the point that both Leonid and Anders have made, and I just want to absolutely reiterate that, because that is exactly how things change here. Susan, you posed the deliberately provocative question as to whether this is just an exercise in fiction or fantasy, you know, these plans and these reports about a post-Putin Russia. Well, the fact of the matter is, once things start changing, it's too late to sit down and try to figure out what to do next. And so I want to thank Anders and Leonid for preparing this groundbreaking piece of work. You know, in terms of how things change in Russia, in 1904, Vyacheslav von Plehve, Count von Plehve, the Tsarist interior minister, famously boasted about the need for a small victorious war, in that case against Japan, that was supposed to solve all the domestic problems of the empire. And I don't think he expected that just 1 year later, largely as a result of that war, which turned out to be not so small and not so victorious, Russia was engulfed in our first revolution, and the Tsar had to concede a parliament and civic and political freedoms. When Lenin spoke to a group of young Swiss social democrats in Zurich at the end of January 1917, he ended his speech with the famous phrase, "My generation will not live to see the decisive battles of this coming revolution." The Tsar abdicated 6 weeks later. And I'm old enough myself, just about. I was a child, but when a revolution happens in front of your eyes, you remember it. I was 10 years old in 1991, and I remember very well that nobody, as Leonid and Anders already made that point, nobody at the beginning of August 1991 predicted that the Soviet regime will not last until the end of the month, and that the Soviet Union itself would not last until the end of the year. This is how things happen in Russia. So those people who say today that Putin is forever, he's so popular, he's so confident, he's so strong, and all the rest of it, the system is going to withstand any pressure. These people really do remind me of those Western criminologists who said in mid-1991 the same things about the Soviet regime, and then we saw what happened. To answer your question, yes, things are changing dramatically here in terms of public opinion. It's visible, it's clear. I mean, we can point to things like opinion poll figures, right? For example, 59% of Russians in a recent Levada Center poll who want comprehensive change in the country. 62%, nearly 2/3, who want to age limit the presidency at 70, meaning that Putin can no longer stay in power after 2024. We can point to election results, even those doctored, unfair, manipulated elections that we have here. We see that increasingly pro-Kremlin, pro-Putin candidates are being sent to humiliating defeats, literally against no one. They're losing to technical spoilers who just happen to be on the ballot, as people are finding any possible way to send a message. Because of course, as everybody here knows very well, most real opposition candidates are not allowed to run in Russian elections. They're disqualified ahead of time. And yet we saw in Moscow, for example, in 2019, in the city Duma elections, in nearly half the districts, the pro-Kremlin candidates lost to people who did nothing, who had conducted no campaigns, held no rallies, spent nothing on elections, just because they were not the candidates for the Putin party. And we saw the same repeated last year in the local elections, especially in Siberia. And of course, one of the main areas of focus for Alexei Navalny and his movement is to repeat this on a national scale this September in the upcoming parliamentary elections. We certainly see this change in the protests, Susan, that you began with today. In January, hundreds of thousands of people all across the country, literally from the Baltic Sea to the Pacific Ocean, came out to protest the arrest of Alexei Navalny after his return to Moscow. These were the largest, quote unquote, unauthorized demonstrations since the end of Soviet rule. These were the rallies that people knew if they went to them, they could be detained, they could be beaten, they could be arrested, they could be sacked from their jobs, they could be expelled from universities, and many were. And yet hundreds of thousands of people went all across the country in a show of defiance. You remember January 23rd, then again January 31st. But I think the most important and the most visible way you can see that things are changing here is just by being around people every day. And I have to say, it's the change in these past few months has been really visible. Leonid mentioned Putin's press conference that usually takes place, this staged managed event that takes place every December. several hours long, of course, pre-doctored, carefully selected questions, broadcast on state television. And it's happened before the new year, so sometime in December, I don't remember the date. And Leonid said that, people just don't care anymore. They don't pay attention. That is certainly true of, I would say, most people. But what I am also noticing is how willing people now are to publicly share their negativity about this regime. This is no longer like, the Soviet times when people would complain in the privacy of their own kitchen. People are doing this openly in public. I remember I had a few errands to run around the city on the day of Putin's press conference. And, it was broadcast on screens in a lot of public places, like that image from Orwell's 1984, that movie. So the big brother on the big screen and, people in the room. A lot of public places have TV screens. You can see the window shops have TV screens. You can see Putin there. And you wouldn't believe what people are saying, how people are willing to share how much they're fed up with this guy after more than 20 years in power. And, just random people, taxi drivers, somebody in the notary's office, someone in the grocery store, just people around. And to me, I think this is actually the most visible and the strongest way that this change can now be seen. Yes, things are definitely changing in Russia. And on the one hand, we do have this increasing repression and these National Guard people who are beating up peaceful demonstrators and hundreds of political prisoners. And the leader of the opposition, whom they tried to kill and who is now under arrest. This is all sort of one side of the picture. But the other side of the picture is rapidly and visibly and fundamentally shifting public attitudes here against this regime. And this is especially visible among the young generation. There were several surveys conducted at the January protests. The median age of the protesters was 31. So that's a generation that's sort of now coming into age, if you want, now beginnings of the active professional lives. This is a generation that has not seen, or at least does not remember, any leader in the Kremlin except Putin, because he's now been in power for more than 2 decades. And that is also the generation that is increasingly saying enough is enough. And so just as the previous two speakers, I'm very hopeful and very optimistic about the next few years here in Russia, especially around the mid-2020s, 2024, 2025. I think those will be the big years of change. Not only, Susan, because I'm as you put it, a professional optimist, but also because I'm a historian by education, and we know how these things can happen in Russia.
So, Sandy, Ambassador Vershow, I want to go back to Washington for a moment, the land of definitely not professional optimists. We have a new administration here as well. And I think Russia in some ways may prove to be an early test of what kind of foreign policy the Biden administration is going to have. How are they going to respond to Navalny's arrest? How are they going to respond to the SolarWinds hacking? You read this report, you've seen a lot of previous rounds of protests in Russia. I'm interested in two things. One, your assessment of whether this time really is different. And then number two, and most importantly, I think, what, if anything, do you think the Biden administration will do, and what should it do, if those are the same thing or not, when it comes to putting pressure to achieve those ends? You have pointed out over the years, I think, very correctly, that Putin's always been most afraid of a US that actively got involved in exactly the conversation we're having today, a regime change conversation. Is Joe Biden the kind of guy who's going to get the US involved in that?
Thanks, Susan. First of all, let me say what a great report this is. It's, it may seem a strange time at the time when Putin is intensifying his repression, getting more and more paranoid about Western interference and promotion of regime change, that this is the time to write a report like this. But I think it is kind of visionary on one level and practical on another level. And I think it's important to just underscore what Vladimir just said, that we shouldn't yield to the cliche that Russia is never going to be democratic. It's genetically predetermined to be an authoritarian state. Change can happen. We saw it in the 80s and 90s. It even came from within the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. So clearly there were a lot of reasons why it didn't succeed, but I think the potential for a shift is possible. And I think the Biden administration understands the potential for change, but also is realistic about what can be done while Putin is still in control. Clearly, we have to somehow put pressure on Putin first of all, to end his aggressive behavior abroad, which is depriving the Russian people of a more positive future. It's cutting Russia off from foreign investment. It's turned Russia into a pariah state by carrying out aggression against its neighbors. So we need to, first of all, create incentives for today's regime to pull back from its aggressive imperialistic posture and pay more attention to the needs of its own people and to the economic development, which has been stagnant, even as Russia has made itself great again on the international stage. So I think the Biden administration will be tough when it comes to the direct aggression against Ukraine and other neighbors, against the cyber hacking, against the efforts to undermine our democracies. I think it will at the same time be humble about how much we can influence internal change in Russia, but try to create more favorable conditions for civil society to reconsolidate, for democratic forces in Russia to begin to be heard again, so that if there is a democratic breakthrough, there will at least be something to work with, despite Putin's efforts since he became president 21 years ago to dismantle civil society, independent media, the rule of law, and all the things that need to be put back into place. But I think the hardest part of this is reaching out to those young Russians who do want change, who are reflecting increasing impatience and discontent with the Putin system. How can we somehow connect through the media, through social media? Can we get exchanges going again? Putin's doing everything he can to block these avenues of influence by the West. We just have to do it as much as we can through broadcasting, through more liberal visa policy, so that people can come here and at least start meeting counterparts, gain expertise, so that when the breakthrough comes, some of the kinds of original thinking on the part of the young Russians will already be kind of taking shape, and we won't be sort of looking at starting from a complete blank slate. The report points out that Russia does have some capacity already, macroeconomic stability, things that Putin has done, which put them in a more favorable position than they were in 1989, 1990, 1991. But at the end of the day, the Russian people are going to have to do this themselves. But I think that we can help at least a little bit to create more favorable conditions for them to shed the imperialist foreign policy, reconnect with the West, and start rebuilding their own society in the way that Leonid and Anders have laid out.
So, Carol, I want to bring you in now for another voice from the ground in Russia. First of all, tell us your assessment of how, if at all, the politics have changed inside Russia as a result of these Navalny protests. And then secondly, I'm struck in this report that Anders and Leonid focus really on two changes that are extremely significant, which is essentially the elimination of the KGB state mentality and the transformation from a presidential system to a parliamentary system, much more European style political system in Russia. I'm curious what you think about the feasibility, the possibility of those recommendations working for a new Russia. Is it just a sort of a Washington think tank fantasy, or do you think that the people in the streets in Moscow right now, that they themselves can begin to imagine a post-Putin political future?
Thank you, Susan. First of all, I would like to say I'm very pleased to participate in this discussion, and it is a honor for me to represent Novaya Gazeta here. And the quick answer on the question is it's a kind of question about political struggle and political imagination. We have a very, very very big discussion in Russia now what kind of future we can imagine for our country. And one of the answers on this question is the future is a kind of democratic one, European one, and so on. And for me personally, we have no ways to imagine some kind of another future for this country, for our country. And I strongly agree that Russia is changing right now. I also see how Kremlin is resisting these changes. For example, any actions of any independent politician are officially explained now as a foreign interference. And so we probably actually in one step away from some kind of show trials on spies. If you want to make any independent policy in Russia, you can be claimed, they can say you are a kind of spy. And as a journalist, I would like to say this year could be also critical for the future of independent media in Russia. Censorship is on the rise. And as a newspaper, for example, we pay weekly fines for violating more and more legal prohibitions, which is posed by the state. And we actually cannot attract any investors, as you know. And so if our journalists are not killed, journalists of Novaya Gazeta, then they just want to destroy us in economical sense. But we believe that we are still doing our duty. Russia needs honest journalism. This is our country, and no one can do this work expect of us. So we still believe that we must and we can fight for democratic and European future for our country. And I agree that we need a kind of, if we can imagine a kind of democratic breakthrough in some future, we need to hold a kind of consistent constitutional assembly, which will adopt a new constitution for sure, and possibly significantly stretch the system of checks and balances, weakening the figure of president, or even choose a parliamentary republic as a basis. And I also would like to add that we need to improve real local self-government and create conditions for emergence of local communities and local politicians. And this is a crucial task for democratic future of Russia.
So Leonid and Anders, I want to ask both of you before we get to the questions about probably the most controversial aspect of the previous effort to democratize Russia in the immediate aftermath of the Soviet Union. And that, of course, was privatization, something that Putin continued to cite as a reason, as a cause of what he described as Russia's instability in the 1990s and the dysfunction that he was going to come in and fix. How do you avoid losing sort of the popular narrative in any next shot at democratizing Russia? And what lessons, Leonid, do you take away from the previous effort to change Russia in such a fundamental way? Leonid, we can't hear you.
So that's a very serious question. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I think that we have better chances today to overcome such negative aspects of last attempt to build democracy in Russia. For several reasons, we have better chances. First, we have now we have very strong part of the society, which is definitely, for sure, for democracy and for all the aspects of democracy. And of course, they do not trust to this system, but I hope they will trust to the new people. We have now people who are trusted by other people, and I think it's important. It's important thing. I think we made some mistakes. And these mistakes were not only in economical point of view, and we have Anders who understand it much better than myself, but we made some symbolic mistakes. We make some mistakes we underestimate the importance of democratic institutions. We really believed that when we have normal economy, market economy, so the democratic institutions will develop themselves, and that it's natural for market economy. Now we see that no, it was a mistake, of course, and then we didn't make some symbolic things which are very important, very important. For example, the Kremlin cannot be the office of the president of Russia, because the Kremlin associated with the tyranny, the Bolshevik tyranny and the tyranny of Moscow Tsars and so on. So it cannot be the place. It cannot be the place. Like, I don't know, the prison Bastille cannot be the place of the president, of the office of the president of France. Or Tower in London cannot be the residence of the Queen. The same about the Kremlin. We didn't make some important thing to destroy KGB. The KGB must be destroyed because it's a criminal organization. It didn't change from Dzerzhinsky period. And about privatization and everything, you know, Putin says something about privatization now, as well as we said, but his system, it's a falsification, it's illusion. He created the life of illusion. For example, he says something about elections, but they are not elections. He says something about market economy, but it's not market economy. He says something about privatization, about independent enterprises. They are not independent, they are controlled by the state. And I think that maybe, except some important steps which we discussed in this text and which are discussing now in our society, we must return back to real life, to reality from the falsification of this reality. You know, I think that the beginning of the destroying of the communist system in Russia, the date when it began, it was June 22nd, 1941, because it was the day when the orders of Mr. Stalin was not important, because he couldn't change the reality. He signed an order that we must push Hitler troops out from our Holy Land and then stop on our borders. Okay, this order had no any connections to reality. And Hitler's troops, they didn't follow his orders. So it was the first case when the Russians or Soviets, they understood that the order of the first figure means nothing for reality. So we must return back to reality. And I think that the very serious group of society, the most active group of society, are ready to return back to reality.
So Anders, just quickly, on this question of privatization and what, if anything, you would do differently if you got a do-over this time. What do you think about that in your thinking about the next time that Russia democratizes?
Yeah, thank you, Susan. We spent a couple of pages to this in the report, so thank you very much for bringing it up, because I think this is one of the most difficult questions. The short answer is everything has to be done differently, because now there are different possibilities. The first thing that needs to be done is property rights. Property rights mean rule of law. So one needs to change the judicial system. No country in the former Soviet Union today has property rights. I'm not including the Baltic countries as former Soviet republics. So that means that property is all the time being redistributed by the government or people who are closer to the government. First, property rights, then good corporate governance in the big state companies according to the standard OECD principles, and that takes time. And then you have the problem, Russia has slightly more than 50% of GDP today coming from the state sector. with so much in the state sector, you will have lots of money in the state companies that will go to political parties that can use that in order to win the elections. So you have an impossible dilemma. If you privatize too fast, you will get a strong reaction against it because some people will make fortunes on the privatization, however you do it. And if you don't privatize fast, you have a big risk to democracy. We see Poland, that did wonderfully for 30 years, is now its democracy is threatened, partly because the big state companies are now expanding and they have pretty much captured the political power. The media, the energy companies, the big banks. So even Poland is not immune to this risk. So unfortunately, there's no good solution. People, by and large, don't want the big companies to be privately owned because they don't like the really rich, however they make the money. And that has to be, to some extent, tolerated because it's not politically possible. So I think that one should move much more slowly. It's much easier to do it now when there are market prices that are reasonable and it's defined what the enterprises are, as was not the case in the early 90s. You had to fight in order to clarify what belongs to one enterprise and can you control it. If you don't have corporate governance, then you have to have concentrated ownership by one small group of people. That is not necessarily the case any longer. So this will be one of the most difficult questions, however we do it.
So I want to get to the questions from the audience. We have a very limited amount of time, but Vladimir, I want to go to you next just quickly. First of all, everyone's going to want to be asking, what level of risk do you feel like you and other activists currently face? Navalny was just poisoned. You yourself have been poisoned twice. And again, I recommend to everyone, if they haven't already, to read the extraordinary report from Bellingcat about your own experience. But what is your current feeling about the level of risk and your ability to continue to operate safely in Moscow? And related to that, the most important conclusion in this report about a post-Putin democratic Russia is the need for the elimination of the KGB and essentially the security service rule over Russia. Do you agree with that? And is that at all feasible in your view?
Thank you very much, Susan. Thanks for both of those questions. Well, you used the word safety and safety a couple of times. I don't think that's a word that's appropriate to anything that we do here. Yes, you can read the Bellingcat report. You can read the previous Bellingcat report into the Navalny poisoning. You can read the latest list from the Memorial Human Rights Center that we have nearly 400 political prisoners in our country today. But frankly, we don't even need to do all of this because, we're coming up in a couple of days to the 6th anniversary of the assassination of Russian opposition leader Boris Nemtsov, who was literally gunned down a couple of 100 meters from the Kremlin wall. Everybody knows the chain of command. It was detailed in last year's landmark report from the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, including witness testimony when, where, and how Putin gave the order for that assassination. And yet, 6 years on, beyond the immediate lowest level of the perpetrators of the crime, no one has faced any responsibility. The organizers and masterminds are still free, still at large, and still fully shielded and protected from the highest levels of the Russian state. I think if you can murder the opposition leader in front of the Kremlin and get away with it, I don't think we should talk about risks or safety. I mean, everybody knows everything by now, frankly. If sort of the underlying question, Susan, is why are we still here and why are we still doing this? Well, because the biggest gift I think we could give to the Kremlin and to the Putin regime would be if we all just gave up and ran. That's all they want from us. And in fact, as you know, they tried to make sure Alexei Navalny did not return here. They made the announcements of all the new criminal cases while he was still in Germany, recovering from the poisoning, in the hope that he would not come back here. There was never any question in his mind, of course, just as there was never any question in my mind after both poisonings that I'll be back here as well, because the most effective way, actually, for the regime to silence and neutralize its opponents is not to arrest or to jail them, but to actually make sure that they leave the country. This was the same conclusion that Yuri Andropov came to back in the 70s when he was head of the Soviet KGB, and when he began to forcibly expel leading dissidents of the time, Solzhenitsyn, Bukovsky, Orlov, Ginsburg, and many others, because once an opponent, a dissident, a political leader is outside of the country, he or she loses not only the sort of everyday connections, that's, I suppose, less relevant now in the modern world with all the technology we have, but most importantly, they would lose the moral authority and the moral right to continue, because, you cannot be a Russian politician and not be in Russia. It doesn't work that way. So for that very reason, and because, to go back to the earlier part of our conversation, because we know there are so many people around Russia who fundamentally disagree with the Putin regime and everything it stands for, and who want Russia to become, to use the words of Alexei Navalny in a recent interview, a normal European country. We know there are millions of people in Russia who share that goal. And for their sake, we must and we will continue. As for the second question, thank you for raising it. That's something I wanted to actually address myself. That's why I put the raised hand on. I think that's the most crucial. That's the most crucial point of Anders and Leonid's report. One of the most talked about issues here this week is the upcoming return of the statue of Felix Dzerzhinsky, the founder of the Soviet Cheka, the Bolshevik secret police, to Lubyanka Square, from where it was spectacularly dismantled in August 1991 after the victory of our democratic revolution. These images are probably the most enduring and the most well-known images from Russia's 1991 revolution, the images of the statue of the founder of the KGB hanging from a noose as a crane lifted it from its pedestal. And now it looks like this monument is coming back to its previous place. And I think one of the most powerful symbols you can imagine for what Putin is doing. But the problem was, of course, and Anders alluded to this in his remarks earlier, the problem was essentially that everything was limited with the monument back in 1991. The system itself survived, the structure itself survived. There were some far-sighted voices back then, not looking 30 years later, but back at the time, people like Vladimir Bukovsky and Galina Starovoytova and some others, but not too many others, who were saying that this is not enough. We need to make sure the system is dismantled. We need to make sure its crimes are made public. We need to make sure the archives are open. We need to make sure there is some kind of a lustration process of the type we saw in other countries in Eastern Europe. We didn't have any of that. And in the end, it was just about the monuments. And as Anders and Leonid mentioned, the system survived, the system stayed in place. It changed the name, but nothing else. And the nature, as we see, is still the same. They still operate professional poisoners, professional squads of assassins. They still put people in prison for their political views. Everything is just as it was. And I think that was the biggest mistake of our failed democratic transformation in the 1990s, this unwillingness or inability to really turn over the page and to really make sure that a return to the past will never again be possible, just as it's impossible to imagine a return to Nazism or Honecker-style communism in Germany today, precisely because they did make those steps to make sure that this can never repeat itself. Back in 1991, or in early 90s, I should say, about 92, 93, when it became clear that these efforts are not going to happen, Bukovsky warned members of Yeltsin's government that you are making a very big mistake. This is like dealing with a wounded beast, he said. If you don't finish it off, it will come back and attack you. Of course, that is exactly what we saw at the end of 99 with Putin's ascent to power. And that is a mistake we cannot allow ourselves to repeat again the next time Russia has that window of opportunity for change. And I want to thank, again, Anders and Leonid for making that a central point in the report, because it is a central point. And that's going to be the number one issue when we do face that next transition to democracy, to make sure to dismantle the repressive criminal apparatus of the Soviet secret police that is still with us today.
So we're going to run out of time. So Ambassador Vershbow, I'm going to jump into the first couple of questions and give them to you to answer. These two questions both, really revolve around what to do about Russia at this moment in time. First of all, there's a question from a former EU ambassador, Paul Van Doren. What do you consider to be the appropriate EU policy toward Russia in the present circumstances, in the short to medium term, given the disruption we're talking about? And secondly, this is an interesting one from a professor at Fordham Law School, William Janis, which is, what about China? How would China view a post-Putin democratic Russia in the long term? Would it be able to support that? Would it intervene in some way? How does this complicate the narrative of sort of these rising autocracies pushing back on the United States?
Thanks. Big questions, but I'll give short answers. First of all, I think the EU needs to work closely with the Biden administration and come up with a unified strategy. Unless we're united in taking the same stance, we're less likely to have any effect on Putin's behavior and have any luck in creating some of the conditions that need to begin to emerge in which democratic change can start unfolding again in Russia. In the short term, it's more about containment, putting more pressure on the regime to get out of Donbass, end its aggression in other parts of the world, make clear that we want to work with Russia. Certainly, we want to stabilize the relationship in areas like arms control, but a more fundamental change in the relationship does depend on Russia changing its behavior. That means Europe and the United States speak with one voice, don't allow the Russians to play us off against each other, and demonstrate strategic patience, accept that the change isn't going to come in immediately, but if we're firm, we can over time begin to force Putin to recalculate and hopefully allow more progressive forces to be heard once again. On China, I mean, they've obviously taken the view that Gorbachev destroyed the Soviet Union, destroyed the communist system, so they will be very skeptical of a return to the democratic path in Russia. But I think their main agenda is to protect their own system against outside interference and pressures for change, which we have to counter. But I don't think they're going to be actively trying to interfere in Russia to block this. I could be wrong, but I think they consider themselves strong enough to fend for themselves without having to tell Russia what to do.
So, Kirill, I want to ask you, we're running out of time, but there are two very provocative and I think very important questions here that bring it back to the reality of the situation inside Russia. Number one comes from Olga Sadowy, and she asked, isn't the world putting too much hope in Alexei Navalny, given his nationalism, his views on migrant workers and the annexation of Crimea? Is he really the answer to Russia's woes? And I think that's obviously an important conversation to bring it back to the reality of the situation right now.
I believe that Alexei Navalny is a kind of symbolic figure, and he represents hope and change. And I think that people around the country just find some politician, some figure to connect their hopes, and they asking for changes with someone. And the only person who can provide this hope and change is Navalny for now. I don't believe that this asking for change is somehow connected with nationalism of Navalny in last years and so on. So I believe we just need to start some democratic process in Russia, and Navalny can bring us this kind of changes.
So here's another quick question for you, and I'm also going to ask it to Leonid and Vladimir, since you're all on the ground in Russia. It's a provocative question from Frank Bustamante, which is which office or agency or action is likely to signal the beginning of the end for the Putin regime? I'd be curious with all of your answers on that. Kirill, why don't you start?
Maybe someone else would like to start. It's a harsh question for me.
Leonid and Vladimir, do you have any thoughts on that? What would be the event that we should look at and say, wow, that's it. This is really going to happen?
Well, what was it?
Well, I think, one of the biggest ironies about the Putin regime is that they keep accusing us, those who are in the opposition, of trying to foment some kind of a color revolution, some kind of a Maidan. I mean, that's sort of the constant leitmotif of the Kremlin propaganda. In fact, if anybody is laying the ground for such revolutionary changes. It's those people who have destroyed elections as a meaningful institution of changing the government, who have made sure, in fact, that the government cannot be changed through the ballot box, and that the same man has now stayed in power for now into his third decade in the Kremlin. If anybody is preparing the ground for some kind of a street upheaval, it's those people who are in the Kremlin today, because you know, at some point, society, the critical mass of society is gonna get enough of this. It's gonna be fed up, and I think we are fast approaching that point. So to answer the question, I think the biggest factor of change, the biggest proof of change, the biggest symbol of change will be the sight of people on the streets in numbers that will be too big for the regime's repressive apparatus to do anything about, just as we saw in Serbia, in Georgia, in Armenia, in the Orange Revolution in Ukraine in 2004, all of those peaceful, velvet, democratic revolutions that have toppled kleptocratic and authoritarian regimes in our part of Europe.
So Anders, I know you wanted to get in here, and Leonid as well. We're basically out of time, so I'll give both of you just a very short final thought on this.
I would answer the Security Council, which means about every 10th day. Almost everybody is present all the time. It's the 13 people. It's all the top Silaviki. And if we should specify any group, it's the current and former chairman of FSB, Bortnikov, Patrushev, and Sergei Ivanov. These are the people who could turn against Putin at the very top. But of course, as Vladimir said, it should be unrest at the popular level, and that people at the top think that Putin doesn't manage it well. Thank you.
Leonid, you get the final word in our conversation today.
Thank you so much. I have one request to all of you. Please do not overestimate the specificity of Russia. Russia is a normal country. It's a normal country. And the Russians, as your prominent psychologist, Abraham Maslow, when he traveled to India being a postgraduate student, he said that the main conclusion is that Indians are human beings first, and only after this Indians. So Russians are human beings first. So it means that they have the same soul, they have the same ideas, they have the same intentions to democracy, to freedom, and so on. Of course, we have very difficult history and very difficult present state, of course. But I think that there are no serious reasons to think that these barriers to our moving to democracy are fatal barriers. And I think that we really, not because I'm a stupid optimist, but because I'm living here in Russia, I think that in these very days, we have a hope.
Well, that's a powerful note to end this conversation on. I have to say, I wish we could keep going all morning here in Washington with this group of people. And I know there's a lot of important questions we didn't get to, but I want to thank everyone for joining us today. You can read the website, Russia Without Putin, on the Atlantic Council's website. And I want to thank Anders Åslund and Leonid Gozman for writing the report, Kirill Martynov, Vladimir Kara-Murza, Ambassador Sandy Vershbow for joining us, and for all of you this morning. Really, what an important and stimulating conversation. Thank you again to everyone for joining us.
Thank you.